The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel shimmered beneath a constellation of crystal chandeliers, their light cascading over silk tablecloths and champagne towers that seemed to touch the ceiling. The annual Business Excellence Gala brought together the most powerful names in American commerce, a night where deals worth billions were whispered over caviar and sealed with handshakes between courses. Victoria Okonkwo stood near the entrance, adjusting the sleeve of her midnight blue Valentino gown, watching the parade of privilege with the measured gaze of someone who had fought for every inch of ground she now commanded. At 42, she was the founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies, a company she had built from a cramped apartment in Detroit into a global powerhouse worth over $12 billion. Her journey had been marked by obstacles that would have broken lesser spirits, investors who refused to meet with her, board members who questioned her every decision, and countless moments when doors slammed in her face simply because of the color of her skin. Tonight, however, she was here for something monumental. The Whitmore family, old money aristocrats whose construction empire stretched across 3 continents, had approached her 6 months ago about a partnership that would revolutionize sustainable infrastructure. The deal was worth $650 million, and it represented everything Victoria had worked toward: legitimacy in circles that had long excluded people who looked like her. Richard Whitmore Sr., the patriarch, had personally courted her, his silver tongue promising a new era of collaboration. His wife, Eleanor, had hosted her at their Connecticut estate, praising her vision while servants poured tea into cups that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria had done her due diligence, of course. She knew the Whitmores' reputation, their charitable foundations that seemed more interested in tax breaks than actual charity, their history of quietly settling discrimination lawsuits, their son who had been expelled from 3 prep schools before Daddy's donations secured him a spot at an Ivy League institution. But business was business, and the partnership made strategic sense. She had learned long ago to separate personal feelings from professional calculations. What she hadn't calculated, however, was the presence of Brandon Whitmore III, the family's 24-year-old heir, who was currently holding court near the bar, his loud voice cutting through the refined murmur of the gala. He was surrounded by similarly entitled young men, their laughter sharp and mocking as they surveyed the room like predators assessing prey. Victoria noticed him glancing in her direction several times, his expression shifting into something unreadable. She dismissed it as unimportant and turned her attention to the evening's program, unaware that the next hour would change everything, not just for herself, but for the entire Whitmore dynasty. Victoria had just finished a productive conversation with a senator about upcoming infrastructure legislation when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Brandon Whitmore standing uncomfortably close, a glass of red wine swirling in his hand, his eyes glassy with intoxication. His friends lingered a few feet away, phones raised in what she immediately recognized as recording positions. "So you're the famous Victoria Okonkwo," Brandon said, his words slightly slurred but carrying an unmistakable edge of contempt. "My father won't shut up about you. Victoria this, Victoria that. It's honestly getting embarrassing." Victoria maintained her composure, offering a diplomatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father has been very gracious throughout our negotiations. I'm looking forward to finalizing our partnership." Brandon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Partnership. Right. You know what I think? I think my father is doing you a favor. Without our name attached to your little company, you'd still be nobody. Just another diversity hire that corporations trot out for their annual reports." The words stung, but Victoria had weathered far worse. She was about to excuse herself when Brandon stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberately threatening. "You know what the problem is with people like you? You forget your place. You think because you've got some fancy title and a nice dress that you belong here with us. But you don't. You never will." Before Victoria could respond, Brandon raised his wine glass and deliberately poured its contents over her head. The crimson liquid cascaded down her face, soaking her hair, running down her gown in rivers that looked disturbingly like blood. The ballroom fell silent. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and then she heard it, Laughter. Richard and Eleanor Whitmore were standing 15 feet away, and they were laughing. Not the horrified, nervous laughter of people who couldn't believe what their son had done, but genuine amusement, as if Brandon had just told a particularly clever joke. Eleanor even raised her champagne flute in a mock toast. Victoria stood perfectly still, wine dripping from her chin onto the marble floor. She felt the eyes of hundreds of people upon her, felt the weight of their judgment, their pity, their scorn. She also felt something else awakening deep within her, a cold, calculating fury that had been forged in decades of fighting against exactly this kind of humiliation. Without a word, she reached into her clutch, pulled out a handkerchief, and slowly, deliberately, wiped her face. Then she looked directly at Richard Whitmore Sr. and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. The Whitmore family's laughter died in their throats as they watched Victoria Okonkwo walk calmly to the restroom, her wine-soaked gown leaving a trail of crimson droplets across the pristine marble floor. Richard Whitmore Sr. was the first to recover his composure, quickly arranging his features into an expression of practiced concern. "Perhaps we should go apologize," he muttered to Eleanor, though his tone suggested obligation rather than genuine remorse. "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor replied, touching up her lipstick with the casual disregard of someone who had never faced consequences for anything in her life. She should be grateful we're even considering this partnership. Brandon was just having a bit of fun. These people need to learn to take a joke. In the restroom, Victoria stood before the mirror, methodically removing the wine from her skin and hair with dampened paper towels. Her assistant, Marcus, had rushed in after her, his face stricken with outrage on her behalf. "I'm calling the police," he said, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. "That was assault. I'm calling the lawyers. You're going to do nothing," Victoria said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost serene, but Marcus had worked with her for 7 years and recognized the steel beneath the surface. "Ms. Okonkwo, you can't just let them." "I said nothing." She met his eyes in the mirror. "Do you trust me, Marcus?" He nodded slowly, confusion and faith warring on his young face. Victoria returned her attention to her reflection, noting with clinical detachment the way the wine had ruined her carefully styled hair, the way her makeup had streaked despite being advertised as waterproof. She thought about her mother, who had cleaned houses for families like the Whitmores, who had taught her that dignity wasn't something others could take from you. It was something you carried within yourself, impervious to their attempts at destruction. She thought about her daughter, Zara, who was home right now, probably finishing her calculus homework, blissfully unaware that her mother had just been publicly humiliated by people who saw her as less than human. And she thought about the $650 million contract sitting in her briefcase, signed by her but still awaiting Richard Whitmore's signature, a contract that, by its very terms, gave her considerable power in this situation. Victoria smiled again, and this time it was genuine. She had built an empire from nothing. She had outmaneuvered competitors with 10 times her resources. She had survived recessions, hostile takeovers, and a global pandemic that had decimated lesser companies. The Whitmores had just made the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when Richard Whitmore's phone rang. He fumbled for it on his nightstand, squinting at the screen with bleary, bourbon-dulled eyes. When he saw Victoria Okonkwo's name, a flash of irritation crossed his face, followed by something that might have been the faintest tremor of unease. He had expected her to call eventually, probably crying, possibly threatening legal action, definitely fishing for some kind of financial settlement to soothe her wounded pride. Richard had dealt with situations like this before. His checkbook had always been an effective salve for hurt feelings, and he had no doubt it would work again. "Victoria," he said, forcing warmth into his voice. "I'm so glad you called. I wanted to know that Eleanor and I are absolutely mortified by Brandon's behavior tonight. He's young, you understand, and sometimes young people, Richard." Her voice was ice. "I'm calling to inform you that I'm withdrawing from the partnership. Effective immediately." The unease Richard had felt moments ago crystallized into genuine alarm. "Now, let's not be hasty. I understand you're upset, and rightfully so. Why don't we meet for breakfast tomorrow? I'm sure we can discuss some form of compensation for your discomfort this evening. You misunderstand me, Victoria said. This isn't the negotiation. I'm not looking for an apology or a settlement. The deal is dead. My legal team will be sending formal notification within the hour. Richard sat up in bed, fully awake now. Victoria, please. This partnership represents 18 months of work. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? I know exactly what I'm throwing away. I also know what I'm protecting. My dignity, my company's reputation, and my unwillingness to do business with people who find it amusing to humiliate others based on the color of their skin. She paused. Oh, and Richard? I should mention that I'll be holding a press conference tomorrow morning. I think the public deserves to know what kind of family they're supporting when they hire Whitmore Construction. The video Brandon's friends recorded should make for compelling viewing. The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications. Then he threw back the covers and began making calls of his own. By dawn, he would understand the true scope of the catastrophe that was about to engulf his family. The Whitmores had ruled their world with impunity for generations, protected by wealth, connections, and the assumption that money could fix any problem. They were about to learn that some problems couldn't be bought off, and some enemies couldn't be intimidated. Victoria Okonkwo was both. The video hit the internet at 7:15 in the morning, precisely 30 minutes before Victoria's scheduled press conference. Within an hour, it had been viewed over 10 million times. By noon, that number had quadrupled. The footage was damning in its clarity. Brandon's sneering face, his deliberate, almost ceremonial pouring of the wine, and, worst of all, the unmistakable sound of his parents' laughter in the background. Social media erupted with a fury that caught even Victoria off guard. Hashtags multiplied like digital wildfire. Hashtag Boycott Whitmore trended worldwide within 3 hours. Hashtag Justice for Victoria spawned hundreds of thousands of posts from people sharing their own experiences with racial humiliation. Major corporations began issuing statements distancing themselves from Whitmore Construction before the sun had set. Richard Whitmore watched his world crumble from the war room he had established in his Manhattan office, surrounded by lawyers, crisis management consultants, and public relations experts who all seemed to be speaking a language he couldn't understand. The Pentagon contract is gone, his chief operating officer reported, her face gray with stress. They called 20 minutes ago. Said they can't afford the association. That was $400 million, evaporated like morning dew. Goldman Sachs is pulling out of the Chicago development, someone else added. And the Detroit City Council is holding an emergency meeting to reconsider our bid for the municipal project. Another $300 million. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee. In the span of a single morning, he had lost more money than most people would see in 1,000 lifetimes. And it wasn't stopping. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, canceled meetings, withdrawn proposals, terminated relationships that had taken decades to build. But the financial losses were only part of his torment. The public pillorying was something he had never experienced, something his money and influence had always shielded him from. His face was everywhere, frozen in that moment of laughter, captioned with words like racist and monster and entitled trash. His wife had locked herself in their bedroom, refusing to answer calls from anyone, including their daughter, who was apparently being harassed by protesters outside her apartment. And Brandon, foolish, arrogant Brandon, had fled to their vacation home in Aspen, posting tone-deaf apologies on Instagram that only made things worse. Meanwhile, Victoria Okonkwo stood at a podium across town, calm and composed in a crisp white suit, systematically dismantling everything the Whitmore family had spent generations building. Eleanor Whitmore had lived her entire life in a cocoon of privilege, so complete that she had never once questioned whether she deserved it. Her grandfather had built Whitmore Construction from a single truck and a handful of workers. Her father had transformed it into a national enterprise. Her husband had taken it global. She had assumed, with the certainty of someone who had never been challenged, that this legacy would continue indefinitely, that her son would someday run the company, and his children after him. Now, As she sat in a conference room facing a wall of lawyers, she was learning how quickly empires could fall. The class action lawsuit represents approximately 47 former employees alleging discrimination, the lead attorney explained, his voice carefully neutral. The video has emboldened them to come forward. We're looking at potential damages in the hundreds of millions. Eleanor's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armrest of her chair. This is ridiculous. One incident, one silly prank, and suddenly we're being treated like criminals. Mrs. Whitmore, with respect, the video has provided context for complaints that were previously settled quietly. Employees who signed non-disclosure agreements are arguing they were coerced. Former partners are claiming they were pressured into silence. The EEOC is opening a formal investigation. Richard, who had aged a decade in the past week, spoke without looking up from the table. What are our options? The lawyer's hesitation spoke volumes. Honestly, limited. Your son's actions, combined with your visible reaction, have created a narrative that's nearly impossible to counter. The more you fight publicly, the worse you appear. My recommendation would be substantial charitable donations to civil rights organizations, a formal apology. We apologized. Eleanor snapped. We issued a statement. You issued a statement saying you regretted if anyone was offended, ma'am. That's not an apology. That's damage control, and the public knows the difference. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor thought about her friends at the country club who had stopped returning her calls. She thought about the gala she had been chairing for the children's hospital, from which she had been quietly uninvited. She thought about her daughter, Charlotte, who had called crying yesterday, saying she couldn't take her children to school without being photographed. For the first time in her 63 years, Eleanor Whitmore understood what it felt like to be powerless. She hated it with every fiber of her being. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she would never acknowledge, she hated Victoria Okonkwo even more, not for what Victoria had done to them, but for showing the world what they truly were. 3 weeks after the gala, Victoria Okonkwo sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of Meridian Technologies headquarters, watching the sun set over the Detroit skyline. The city of her birth stretched before her like a tapestry of resilience, abandoned factories being converted into innovation hubs, neighborhoods being rebuilt by the very communities that had been abandoned by traditional investment. Her phone had not stopped ringing since the press conference. Partnership offers flooded in from companies that had previously shown no interest in working with Meridian. Interview requests came from every major media outlet on the planet. She had graced the covers of Forbes, Time, and Essence within the same week, her face becoming a symbol of something larger than herself, the refusal to accept degradation, the insistence on being treated with basic human respect. But Victoria was not interested in becoming a symbol. She was interested in building something lasting, something that would change the world long after the hashtags faded and the news cycle moved on. The Whitmore deal would have been good for business, Marcus said from across the room, where he was organizing her schedule for the upcoming month. But losing it has been better. Victoria nodded slowly. I used to think I needed their validation. Their name, their connections, their approval. I spent so long trying to prove I belonged in their world that I forgot I could build my own. She turned from the window, her eyes bright with purpose. Cancel the rest of my meetings today. I want to visit the community center on Gresham. And call Jamil. I want to discuss expanding our scholarship program. Marcus smiled, the expression carrying years of loyalty and admiration. You know, most CEOs would be celebrating right now. Magazine covers, speaking invitations, offers flooding in. You're the most famous businesswoman in America at this moment. I didn't start this company to be famous, Marcus. I started it to create opportunities for people who look like me, people who grew up where I grew up, people who were told their whole lives that they couldn't succeed. If what happened at that gala helps that mission, then maybe Brandon Whitmore did me a favor. She paused, collecting her things. Though I wouldn't tell him that. His ego certainly doesn't need the encouragement. They shared a laugh, and Victoria headed for the elevator, already planning her next moves. The Whitmores had tried to diminish her, to put her in her place. Instead, They had elevated her to heights even she hadn't imagined. There was a lesson in that, she thought. Power wasn't about crushing others. It was about rising above their attempts to crush you. Richard Whitmore found Victoria at a restaurant 3 weeks later, ambushing her at a corner table where she was reviewing documents over a working lunch. He looked nothing like the patrician figure who had courted her so assiduously months before. His suit was rumpled, his hair unkempt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "We need to talk," he said, sliding uninvited into the chair across from her. Victoria regarded him coolly over the rim of her water glass. "I don't believe we do, Richard. My attorneys have made our position quite clear." "Please." The words seemed to cost him something. Richard Whitmore had never begged for anything in his life. "My company is collapsing. We've lost contracts worth over $2 billion. Banks are calling in loans. Investors are fleeing. My son," he stopped, his voice cracking. "My son tried to hurt himself last week. The pressure, the hatred, the death threats. He's in a facility now, under constant supervision." Victoria felt something shift in her chest. Not quite sympathy, but an acknowledgement of shared humanity. Whatever Brandon had done, she had never wished for his destruction. She had wished for justice, for accountability, for change. Not for a young man to see his life as not worth living. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said quietly. "Truly. Mental health struggles are serious, and I hope he gets the help he needs." Richard leaned forward, desperation naked on his face. "Then help us. Please. Issue a statement saying the feud is over. Tell people you've forgiven us. Your word carries weight now, more weight than mine ever will again. You could save my family." The audacity of the request hung in the air between them. Victoria set down her water glass with careful precision. "Richard, your family spent generations building a legacy of discrimination, exploitation, and cruelty. Your son didn't pour wine on my head because he'd had too much to drink. He did it because he was raised to believe that people who look like me are beneath him, and that belief was confirmed every time he watched you and Eleanor treat your employees, your partners, and your supposed equals with contempt when you thought no one was looking." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You're not sorry for what happened. You're sorry it was caught on camera. You're sorry there were consequences. That's not remorse. It's inconvenience. And I will not provide cover for your family's rehabilitation while they've done nothing to actually change." Richard's expression shifted from desperation to something harder. "You'll regret this. My family has connections you can't imagine. We may be down, but we're not finished." Victoria smiled, the same smile she had given him at the gala, seconds after his son had humiliated her. "Neither am I, Richard. The difference is, I'm just getting started." 6 months later, Victoria Okonkwo stood at a podium in the same Harrington Hotel ballroom where her life had changed. The venue had been transformed for a different kind of event, the launch of the Okonkwo Foundation for Economic Justice, a $100 million initiative aimed at providing capital, mentorship, and opportunities to entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. The room was packed with a different crowd than had witnessed her humiliation. Here were the innovators and dreamers she had built her career supporting, young Black and brown entrepreneurs, women breaking barriers in male-dominated industries, first-generation business owners who had been told 1,000 times that they couldn't succeed. Here also were the allies who had stood with her, who had used their own platforms to amplify her message, who understood that justice required action rather than just words. Victoria looked out at the sea of faces and felt the weight of the moment. 6 months ago, in this very room, I was reminded of something I already knew, that there are people in this world who will try to diminish us because of who we are. They will pour their contempt on us, literally and figuratively. They will laugh at our humiliation. They will assume that their wealth and power will protect them from consequence. She paused, letting the silence build. They are wrong. The arc of history bends toward justice, not inevitably, not automatically, but because people choose to bend it. Because we choose to stand up when we're knocked down. Because we choose to build when others destroy. Because we choose to respond to hate with purpose. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Victoria raised her hand for quiet. I don't want your applause. I want your commitment. Every person in this room has the power to change someone's life, through mentorship, through investment, through simply treating people with dignity and respect. That's the legacy I want to build. Not revenge against those who hurt me, but opportunity for those who deserve it. Later, after the speeches and the photographs and the handshakes, Victoria found herself alone on the same spot where Brandon Whitmore had poured wine on her head. She stood there for a long moment, remembering the shame and the fury and the cold determination that had followed. She thought about the Whitmores, their company now in bankruptcy, their names synonymous with disgrace, their family shattered by the consequences of their own cruelty. She felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet certainty that what she was building would outlast what they had destroyed. 1 year to the day after the gala, Victoria received an unexpected letter. It came not from Richard or Eleanor, but from Charlotte Whitmore Davis, their daughter, the one who had been caught in the crossfire of her family's disgrace, whose children had been taunted at school, whose marriage had nearly collapsed under the pressure. The letter was handwritten, 6 pages long, and it was an apology. Not the carefully crafted non-apology that the Whitmore PR team had issued in the aftermath, but something raw and genuine. Charlotte wrote about growing up in a household where casual racism was as common as casual conversation. She wrote about the moment she had watched her parents laugh at Victoria's humiliation and felt something break inside her, the realization that the values she had inherited were not values at all, but prejudices dressed in expensive clothing. She wrote about the difficult conversations she had since had with her children, explaining why Grandma and Grandpa had done something terrible. She wrote about the donations she had made, anonymously, to civil rights organizations. She wrote about the therapy she was undergoing to understand and unlearn the biases she had absorbed without questioning. And she wrote about hope. Hope that her children would grow up in a world where what happened at that gala would be unthinkable. Hope that Victoria's foundation would help create that world. Hope that forgiveness might someday be possible, even if it wasn't deserved. Victoria read the letter 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. Charlotte? This is Victoria Okonkwo. I received your letter, and I think we should talk. They met for coffee the following week, 2 women from opposite worlds, brought together by trauma and tentatively building a bridge across the chasm of their histories. It wasn't friendship, that would take time, if it ever came, but it was something. It was a beginning. And as Victoria drove home that evening, past the neighborhoods where she had grown up, past the community center her foundation had just finished renovating, past the school where her daughter was thriving, she realized that this imperfect, complicated, ongoing work of building understanding was the true victory. Not the destroyed company or the canceled contracts or the public vindication, but the possibility, however fragile, of change. The possibility that even those raised in privilege could learn to see others as fully human. The possibility that pain could be transformed into purpose. The possibility that one moment of cruelty could spark a movement of justice. Victoria smiled as she pulled into her driveway, where her daughter was waiting on the porch with news about her day. The Whitmores had tried to pour their contempt on her. Instead, they had watered the seeds of a revolution. And it was only just beginning.